and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun Cho. The U.S. and China are out to stabilize the bilateral relations, but strategic competition continues. Today, we look at South Korea's strategy as U.S.-Sino relations become increasingly complex. We also discuss ways to deal with the North Korean threat.
一段时间以来，美方不断滥用出口管制措施。
中韩三国和亚洲各国都应践行开放的区域主义，弘扬包容的亚洲价值。
고도화되고 있는 북한의 핵 미사일 위협에 대해 세계 최대 군사 동맹인 나토와의 협력을 강화하고
In the studio with me, Ambassador James Jeffrey, chair of the Middle East program at the Wilson Center. Ambassador Jeffrey was the special representative for Syria engagement and the special envoy for the global coalition to defeat ISIS. Ambassador Jeffrey also served as the deputy national security advisor during the George W. Bush administration. He was also the U.S. ambassador to Iraq, Turkey, and Albania. Also joining us, Ms. Mary Beth Long, a member of the Leadership Council for Women in National Security. Ms. Long served as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs and Chairman of NATO's high-level group on nuclear issues. Ms. Long was an operations officer for the Central Intelligence Agency, where she was one of 6 women to be first included in the agency's clandestine operations in dangerous areas advanced weapons course. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Now, Ambassador Jeffrey, the U.S. maintained a highly competitive China strategy, but now is out to moderate tensions. And the U.S. allies, which signed on to containment on China implicitly or explicitly, are confused. Key aides to President Biden, Secretary Yellen, Secretary Blinken, and CIA Director all visited China. Now, was it in U.S. strategy to tone down tensions with China if it reaches a certain threshold, or is the U.S. retreating faced with economic headwinds?
First of all, thank you for having me on, Jung. And I can assure you, and your view is, we are not retreating from our position on China. It has not changed. It is one of, as administration officials have said, de-risk, de-conflict, but not disengage, because just like South Korea, China is one of our most important trading partners, and we can't imagine an economic world without China. So we have to cooperate in some areas with it, just as we compete. And in some areas, we confront China, such as on the South China Sea and potentially in Taiwan. So it's a mixed relationship, and we may not be doing a good job explaining it, but it's very important to understand that we're trying to do both. The other thing is, China has faced a lot of blows in the last year. Its best ally, Mr. Putin, is showing himself far weaker. The Ukraine is showing that it is not a second Hong Kong, and there's a lesson there for Taiwan. And the Chinese economy is doing poorly compared to the American. So the United States and our friends and allies, for most those in East Asia, such as Korea, are in a better position now than before.
Ms. Long, even though Ambassador Jeffrey says that the U.S. is not retreating, South Korea joined in on the U.S. pressure campaign against China and now is left awkward with strained relations with China. South Korea called out on Chinese assertiveness and also stated that it is opposed to any changes in the status quo of Taiwan by force. Did the U.S. only follow its own interests and care less about its allies' positions?
No, not at all. And in fact, first of all, I want to thank you for the opportunity to be here and the opportunity to be sharing this with my good friend, Ambassador. Jeffries. Two things really to keep in mind. Number one, China's strategy has always been and continues to be divide and conquer. And that's where it plants little seeds between and among the allies to keep us apart. And that is how it and actually Kim Jong-un basically defeat us. So the one thing for us not to do is divide among ourselves because we lack of understanding. Secondly, even when the United States and Russia or the Soviet Union in those days were building up massive nuclear capabilities to destroy each other, we maintained relationships. And maintaining an upper level dialogue and the ability to speak to one another is key. It's not only key to security, but it's key to maintaining peace on the peninsula. My understanding is that with President Yoon being as strong as he has been, there has never been a time in recent memory that South Korea has been safer and more peaceful and more set its sights on a stable but respectful relationship with China. And that Blinken and our ambassadors spoke before and after the meetings to exchange what was said, what were the sticking points, what were the agreement points. But those kinds of things aren't talked about in public. But, and I'm sure that your representative to NATO in the next couple days, and the Japanese and the Americans will also sit down and review what happened. So what this is two nations that have to get along with each other, the US and China, much like South Korea and China from an economic and trade standpoint, opening up in a dialogue. But actually that inures to the benefit of South Korea, doesn't leave them standing behind, sort of holding the bag. But all of our allies should take comfort in knowing that the two most dangerous guys, nuclear weapon-wise, in the region at least have a dialogue with one another. Not having it is dangerous.
So you really emphasize the importance of maintaining relationships. But when South Korea was balancing between Washington and Beijing, the United States government was not pleased. U.S. government spokesperson said that South Korea has already made the choice when it became the ally to the United States. So in which case, how should South Korea position itself between United States and China?
By following its own best interests, as any country should do. And that best interest, of course, is its alliance with the United States. And there's many years, as we all know, of our working cooperatively, and the United States, as you know, has guaranteed the security of South Korea. That's different than the bumps and the ebbs and the flows in the relationship, which your president is handling very well. Everything from the recent complaints by the Japanese and the island, which is an exercise that happens every year, you'll notice that the pressure on South Korea gets strongest when its relationship with the United States is closest, and when its relationship and its dialogues with Japan are strongest. That's when China gets upset, and that's when China tries to divide and conquer. That's what you're watching play out. I actually think that South Koreans should take reassurance in the fact that everything isn't perfect. Everyone's balancing their relationship, but there's not been a time that I'm aware of in recent years that the U.S. and South Korea have been closer.
Ambassador Jeffrey, do you think China has its own imperatives for seeking to improve relations with South Korea? China is facing slowing economic growth, rising youth unemployment, and declining productivity. The U.S. and a large majority of developed countries are coordinating closely against China in the high-tech sector. Considering Seoul is already in a position of strength, should Seoul be more confident and firm in diplomacy with China?
Once again, as Mary Beth said, Seoul is playing a very positive and, from the standpoint of its national interest, but I think also of ours, positive role with China. Of course, China is interested in relations with South Korea, first of all, to the extent, as Mary Beth said, it can drive a wedge between two powerful allies. It wants to do so. But secondly, as you alluded to, Eun-jung, they need in China economic support, trade, investment in the technology that South Korea has. So it makes sense. And it's also not a bad thing. In many areas, we're continuing our trade with China. John Kerry will be out in China next week to talk about climate issues. It's good to engage with China. You just have to pick and choose. That's what we're doing. It's also what South Korea is doing. And we're very, very pleased, I think, overall with its contribution to regional security, which is very, very big.
Ms. Long, at the DoD, you had policy oversight over the Western Hemisphere, over Middle East and Africa and Southeast Asia. You also said that U.S. should consider carrying out airstrikes to stop missile tests. Do you still stand by that view?
I do. And in fact, one of the things that I think Ambassador Jeffries is referring to is, we have been doing the same policy of deterrence against North Korea for decades. And yet I worry that we have not admitted to ourselves that we have not deterred North Korea. We certainly have deterred them from a physical incursion, but they have advanced their weaponry and their capabilities significantly over the decades. And the reason is we keep doing the same things over and over again and expecting different results. Some people, very famous, said over time that makes us crazy. The consequences for North Korea's advancing missile and nuclear programs have been pretty much zero as far as having them change their mind, because they haven't changed their mind. So there has to be consequences to their repeated violations of UN resolutions and their repeated violations of their obligations under international law. And yet they continue apace. I think that the U.S., much like the position that your president is taking, needs to take a very firm, a very public position that everything is on the table, that nothing, kinetic or otherwise, military or otherwise, is off the table as far as holding the North Koreans to a peaceful resolution for whatever it wants to do in the region. And it cannot be through a nuclear program and missiles. There has to be consequences. And if that includes strikes, then so be it.
I would just like to say and reassure your viewers that when Mary Beth and I were in the government, we kept her finger as far away from the launch button as we possibly could. That said, while I wouldn't go as far as to strike, we do need, as she said, to take further steps. This involves more coordination under the current arrangement set up with this nuclear consultative group to engage our South Korean allies in nuclear planning and conventional support by the South Koreans to nuclear planning, and in making very strong gestures, be they with deployments or other actions, including intercepting missiles that are fired towards the United States, that will make the same point she is doing with perhaps a bit less collateral damage.
Yeah. And just to be clear, we're not talking nuclear strike. The original question that you're quoting was, would we use an airstrike to take a nuclear weapon about to be launched off the pad, or what they call it, left of launch? And I think that should be on the table.
But Ms. Long, even though it is not a nuclear launch, even though it's a conventional launch, there are concerns that any kind of airstrike on North Korean missile tests could trigger North Korea's massive retaliation on South Korea and U.S. forces on South Korea.
Absolutely. And that's why one does not use, and perhaps I'm too flippant, but one does not use an airstrike or a strike of any kind flippantly. It would only be in the condition or under the circumstance and that there was a reasonable assessment that whatever was being launched was going to be more destructive than either Japan, South Korea, or the United States could tolerate. In that case, I think all options should be on the table. What I refuse to do is take options on the table so that you restrain yourself or you confine yourself to having absolute certainty that that bomb is on that payload, on that missile, and you wring your hands and miss an opportunity. And there's a difference between actually taking the strike and talking about your willingness to actually undertake that if called upon. And I think the latter is critical.
That point about messaging effect, with that declaration of the intent to intercept North Korean missiles, would that be a powerful message to North Korea to instill fear?
I think it'd be a powerful message to a lot of audiences. North Korea, that the United States will force consequences on strikes that are prohibitively endangering our allies, ourselves, and South Korea in particular, number one. It also sends a message to the Chinese. If we're sincere that there is a limit to U.S. tolerance of the China-North Korea relationship and North Korea being used as a wedge to endanger the U.S. and its allies. And it should also send a message to reassure both the Japanese, the South Koreans, and the region that, look, when we say that you're part of our nuclear umbrella, we mean it. And that means if the time and the circumstance calls for it, we will act on your behalf.
Ambassador Jeffrey, do you agree with the messaging effect that United States states United States is willing to intercept the missiles? Would that give the messaging effect to North Korea?
It would, but as we've all seen repeatedly with what we call red lines in other areas, if you make a commitment, you have to carry it out. We have the capability, trust me, to shoot these things down. So we have to be prepared to do so. I can see that as part of a set of escalatory steps to send a message to North Korea. It would not be my first step. I would work more with usable tactical nuclear weapons development, potentially as a next step, deploying them in South Korea. There's a whole set of steps we can take. We just need to be ready to start doing them because North Korea is not slowing down in its campaign, again, to cite the CIA, to coerce South Korea and the United States, and this is dangerous.
Ambassador Jeffrey, for decades, North Korea has threatened to turn enemy cities into the sea of fire. Should the U.S. and South Korea just watch North Korea conduct a torrid run of missile tests? And the U.S. tried summit diplomacy and working level talks and have all failed. So do you think the U.S. should still pursue dialogue with North Korea to solve the North Korea problem?
Yes, I do. First of all, you're right. These steps have failed, and North Korean threats are increasing, and they're backing it up with military developments. Thus, I concur with the idea that we should have in our toolbox, at the top of it, an escalatory ladder of military steps that will reassure the South Korean population and warn North Korea. But again, we should continue to offer dialogue. It's been North Korea that has been turning us down. We should continue to broadcast to the North Korean people. We should continue to push for democratization, to keep the economic pressure on through sanctions. All of these tools may or may not be all that effective, but they do two things. They show that we're serious. The other thing is the cities that they'll turn into fire may not just be in South Korea. They could be in the United States. So we need to keep the American people on board. Many of them would agree with Mary Beth and I on military actions. Others would like to see negotiations, and still others would like to see things like regime change, and still others pushing human rights. It's important to keep all of those people together in the belief that President Biden and his successor have a conscious, broad policy that will avoid war without risking South Korean or American security. That is how we continue to keep the region under control and peaceful.
Ambassador Jeffrey, U.S. policies to stop North Korea's nuclear and missile development and to stop North Korea's human rights abuses have all failed. Do you think the U.S. should now seek to try to bring some changes within the North Korean government, not outright pursue regime change, but utilizing information campaign or empowering their elites?
Again, it's true that we have failed to stop North Korea's missile program. It is true that we have stopped North Korea from, on the other hand, launching another attack like 1950. That's the most important thing we do in conjunction with South Korea and the other allies and partners who participated in that war and are still on the side of South Korea. So that's the most important thing, and the two of us have been successful, South Korea and the United States. I would pursue these outreach efforts, these democratization and human rights efforts. Again, I may be wrong. I don't think they'll be successful, but I've seen them, against my views, become successful in other areas. But more importantly, many Americans will want to see that as part of the toolkit before they'll sign on to risking American cities to defend South Korean cities, which is where we're rapidly getting to.
Ms. Long, you were CIA operations officer in dangerous areas. A former high-level U.S. officials told VOA in an unofficial setting that North Korea wouldn't know even if U.S. fighter jets launched precision strike against Kim Jong-un's office and came back out from North Korea. given the sensitivity, I wouldn't ask you if U.S. would consider such option, but could you at least tell us if U.S. has such capability?
The U.S. Air Force, as well as some of its other organizations, have incredible stealth capability. And I'm confident and remain even more confident now that I'm out of office than when I was in, that should the U.S. decide to take such a measure, that we would be able to do it clandestinely. Certainly the North Koreans would not notice that we were there. And I think it'd be, given the tyranny of geography, it would be very difficult for another country to identify us and do much about it before we were on our way home.
Ms. Long, the United States and South Korea Nuclear Consultative Group is expected to hold their first meeting in Seoul at the end of this month, and you are chairman of NATO's high-level group on nuclear issues. To what extent do you think South Korea would get involved in terms of nuclear planning and nuclear executions? And given that the threat from North Korea and China are increasing, do you think the U.S. should give more stronger nuclear deterrence and nuclear commitment to South Korea than before?
Well, I think this consultative group is really a tremendous opportunity. And it is based very much on the formula that we used with our nuclear alliance with NATO, and in the processes and how it's organized. And it will give South Korea a lot of visibility in how we go about planning a nuclear response, how we go about escalating, and the process through which we not only ready ourselves, but we go through a series of analyses and activities in order to prepare, not only militarily, but there are a lot of health and other infrastructure and humanitarian concerns for those kinds of decision making. All of that will be laid out, I think, in a much more transparent manner. And it'll be an opportunity for South Korea to weigh in and to make the adjustments that we'll need to make, because again, this is not Europe, and this is a very different organization and a very different time than the NATO's nuclear foundations were laid, number one. Number two, it'll also, I think, allow the South Koreans the ability to provide input and pressure, frankly, on the U.S. to, while it's preparing for a nuclear use or a nuclear option, and while it's readying the South Koreans to understand what that means and how it happens, it'll give the South Koreans opportunities to put pressure on the U.S. to confront, to manipulate, to assuage or persuade North Koreans to do better, and to hold the U.S. accountable for making progress along those lines in parallel to what the committee is actually doing. So it's a tremendous opportunity, I think, to weigh in.
Ambassador Jeffrey, after the U.S. committed to stronger extended deterrence, calls in South Korea for their own nuclear weapons have subsided. But if Pyongyang continues to increase the number and lethality of its nuclear weapons, wouldn't there be growing pressures for South Korea to have countervailing nuclear weapons? And in such circumstances, wouldn't it be justifiable for South Korea to have its own nuclear weapons?
This is a very important question. We're all aware of the polls taken in South Korea and the views of a large majority of the South Korean people, and we do take those into consideration. This is why the nuclear consultative group that Mary Beth talked about is so important in its links to NATO, because what she, out of delicacy, failed to add is that the end of the road with the NATO consultations is hanging American nuclear weapons on the wings of other countries' airplanes in their countries. And that will not be missed in Pyongyang, and that will not be missed in Beijing. This is the nightmare scenario that we would go down that road towards a nuclear capability, if only a combined and joint nuclear capability with the United States. That is the road that North Korea may be pushing us towards. And that is a road that, whatever North Korea thinks, its main support, its main life support comes from China. And this is something that China does not want, because what South Korea can do, Taiwan and Japan can do too.
We will continue our discussion next time. Ambassador Jeffrey, Ms. Long, thank you very much for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.